إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال الله تعالى في كتابه المجيد ولا تستوي الحسنة ولا السيئة صدق الله العظيم وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ليس منا من لم يرحم صغيرنا ولم يوقر كبيرنا أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. My respected brothers and sisters, we begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most gracious, the most merciful, by whose blessings, by whose reward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the ability to be here on this day of Jum'ah, to spend time in His company, to ask Him for du'as, to gain His blessings in general. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that throughout our lives, He gives us His opportunity over and over again and always gives us the tawfiq to act upon it. After that, we send salutations upon our Master Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, all of his companions and all of his family, by whose efforts and by whose example that they set, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it easy for me and you today to believe in La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. My respected brothers and sisters, the last time I was here, we spoke a little bit about the interplay between elders and youngsters in any Muslim community. The reason for this was that this is a kind of demographic that we always interact with. Somebody's always younger than somebody is always older than somebody. So understanding how our deen regulates these interactions is very important. But in general, it is useful to generalize. If I do this in one scenario, can I do that in the other? And today I wanted to generalize the role of the elder in a Muslim community to that of somebody with authority. And how anybody with any authority, young or old, should carry themselves. What are the etiquettes? And what does our deen say about that in particular? But I'd like to begin by talking about the motivation behind asking this question. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions in a hadith, Man sanna sunnatan sayyi'atan. Whoever begins an evil sunnah, begins an evil practice, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it such that whoever does it after him, he gets the sin for that person. And similarly, if you begin a good practice, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards you as if you had done that yourself. An easy example is, a new brother became Muslim. You taught him how to pray salah. Every single time he prays salah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala adds his salah to your book of deeds as well. But let's say, for example, you were on a train with a brother. You were feeling a little frustrated, a little tired, and you were just a little bit callous. You were a little bit cold. And that rubbed him the wrong way. And that motivated him to be cruel to his brother, who motivated him to be cruel to his brother, and so forth. Down the entire road, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues to add to your book of sins. The Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions in another hadith, talking about the concept of bankruptcy. Whereas me and you think of it as something that's financial, has to do with assets, in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, bankruptcy is something which allows people to steal your good deeds from you. And the example the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam gives in that hadith is that you act cruel, callous, and unkind to people. One by one on the day of judgment, as you're walking towards Jannah, they will take a good deed from you, replace it with a sin of their own. These kinds of mistakes and errors are easy to make when you're in any kind of authoritative position. So making sure that we understand not to cross the line and what that line is of utmost importance. And the reason this is following up after talking about elders and youngsters, because the hadith Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions about the interplay between elders and youngsters has a lot of hidden meaning and benefits with respect to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from the people in our community who set an example. The first point is that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, لَيْسَ مِنَّا مَنْ لَمْ يَرْحَمْ صَغِيرَنَا. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam begins with talking about the role of the elder in the community. First and foremost, you have to have mercy on your youngsters. This may seem incredibly simple, but think about the fact that, my dear brothers and sisters, the result of every generation comes from their forebears, who taught them how to walk, who taught them how to speak, to pray and interact with other people. Me and you, when people ask us how our character developed, how we learned these various lessons, we always say, my mother and father taught me. You ask them, their mother and father taught them, and so on and so forth. وَلَمْ يُوَقِّرْ كَبِيرَنَا. And after elders had mercy on the youngsters, then it is the duty of the youngsters to show respect and honor to the elders. But I ask you, my dear brothers and sisters, who will they learn how to give honor to their elders from? Where will they understand what it means to give due respect to people in authority? I learned how to respect elders from watching my father humble himself before other elders. And so on and so forth. And we may think that this has to do with big things. For example, just being good students, for example. That I set a good example for my younger brother or for my child. Or being a good academic, or being good in your career, or being a good Muslim in general. But my dear brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala views the setting of this example on a much smaller scale. If on a general basis, you speak roughly, and a youngster who spends time in the masjid is just looking at you and walking around, he's learning from you. He is intuiting that example you have. An example of youngsters say that they're like a sponge. The environment they're in is water. You put them in, they just soak up everything. On the day of judgment, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks him why and how he learned to speak in this manner, he will point at us. He will point at me and you. And on that day, when we think about our deen and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in general, has a theme of being self-accountable. Right? I answer for my own actions. We think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would dismiss what this young child has to say. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say that, no, these words came out of your mouth. You chose to say them. You are callous and cold. You should be punished. But my dear brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is comprehensive. He does not miss a single detail. He will turn to me and you and ask, are you the one who set this example for this young child? Are you the one who taught him to be this way? So much so that when a child blames his mother, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask the mother first whether she taught the child to do the right thing. This is why, my dear brothers and sisters, every little action we need to always be curious about. The example we get of always being better than you were yesterday isn't just some maxim to follow. It is something that affects our good deeds and our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we are not better than yesterday, how will we be able to set forth an example for our children for them to be better than they were yesterday? Thereafter, my dear brothers and sisters, in the process of setting a good example, there are two critical factors that elders use. One is obviously the a'mal. And this is the best thing. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't simply tell people how to be a good Muslim. He taught them to be good Muslims by what he did. He didn't say speak kindly. He spoke kindly to people and their hearts became soft. He didn't say give charity. The Sahaba saw him give charity and they followed his example. But in tandem with that, my dear brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us nasiha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to wish well for our brothers. Give them advice. Tell them about our experiences. But the last time we also spoke about how every good action, shaitan loves to twist it. Every good action, shaitan wants us to find a way to sin, if possible. It is mentioned about salah that this is the best action anybody could do. Humble and pray before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But let's say you're in the masjid and you notice that the imam is watching you. Then all of a sudden your namaz becomes very long and very focused and you look like you're praying very intensely. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's going on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that you are not trying to please Him. You are trying to please that person who's watching you. Thus, the amal of salah becomes a burden you must answer for. Similarly, my dear brothers and sisters, shaitan places an evil and a poison in nasiha. Because when we give nasiha, there is a tendency to blame. There is a tendency to begin the sentence with, the people of this day do so and so. But one of my teachers, he gave me a piece of advice that has stuck with me a long time. He used to tell us when we were studying poetry of the Arabs. Some examples he gave us were very vulgar. There's a poet and he looked at a woman and he began describing her in ways that would make me and you embarrassed. And he asks us, does this sound familiar to you? But it's so eloquent and from a different language. Me and my classmates are like, no, we don't recognize this at all. So he tells us, think about the way people sing today. The kinds of lyrics you hear in the music and the themes that encompass it in general. You hear the same kinds of derogatory statements. You hear the same kinds of vulgarities. You hear people showing off about evil and bad things. Every fitna you see before you, my dear brothers and sisters, is some repackaged version of a fitna that used to exist before. When we give nasiha about people, there is one particular example we need to follow. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum, many were not believers before. When they became believers, they would teach the new Sahaba, the younger Sahaba. Back in my day, this used to be the case. Don't follow in my example. They used their mistakes to humble themselves before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and teach people a better lesson. But when me and you say you are doing this, when me and say this is something that has affected only you in particular and this is a mistake you need to fix, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at us and wonders, are we so foolish that we don't recognize our own errors? Are we so prideful to think that we are not capable of making such a mistake? Today we complain that the youngsters use TikTok. Back in our day, it was Twitter. Before that, it was Facebook. Every fitna comes back again and again. The way we should give nasiha, my dear brothers and sisters, is not thinking about the other person. It's we recognize the flaw that they have and teach them the lesson that we learned so that they don't have to go through the same experience. If you want somebody to get off of social media, you tell them, when I was young, I used to spend lots of time on this. I used to see a lot of bad things. And I realized that this was poisoning me, that I was interpreting these very bad messages. And I don't want that to happen to you. Instead, we get some flavor of, you are on social media, you are messing up, and you need to fix this. This was not the way of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This was not the way of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, where they tried to fix the society they were in. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam would always try and have empathy. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam would always think about what the man in front of him was feeling first and foremost. When Wahshi bin Harb radiallahu anh, after he killed the uncle of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was just wandering around in Mecca, feeling the weight and burden of the guilt of doing something so sinful, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins to reveal verses inviting him in particular to the deen of Islam. And each time he replies with, I am so far gone. I have drank, I have committed zina. I have killed the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ and fought against the Muslims. I should become a Muslim? And each time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that all you have to do is turn back to me. All you have to do is ask for my forgiveness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't deride the murder of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam's uncle. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't push him away. Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam to soften his heart. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam to show him a kindness that nobody in the Arab world would have given him. And in doing so, brought to the side of Islam an incredibly powerful and fierce warrior. Today, my dear brothers and sisters, when me and you give advice, we push people away. We draw lines and fragment the Muslim community. And in doing so, we are left wringing our hands wondering, no, it's the youth who are wrong. They don't want to listen to our advice. They are hard-hearted and shaitan has gotten to their hearts. When in reality, shaitan is using us to distance other people from the deen of Islam. Lastly, my dear brothers and sisters, having authority is a blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The highest from amongst the creation are the prophets. And for this, they will be blessed with Jannatul Firdaus, Ameen. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will use them to elevate the status of insan in general. After them are the Sahaba, who shed their blood and gave their lives so that me and you can believe in Islam easily. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will honor them too. But for every blessing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us, there is an equivalent burden. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says something very simple in the Quran. لَإِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ. If you are grateful and recognize that the bounties you have are from me, that I am the one who wrote in your destiny that so-and-so will get this much wealth, and will have this nice car, and will have a nice life in general, then I will give you more. Without even asking, you just have to thank me. وَلَا إِن كَفَرْتُمْ. But if you forget me, if you do not remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is your benefactor, إِنَّ عَذَابِي لَشَدِيدٌ. My punishment is then very severe. When we have authority, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us a chance to prove that we are worthy of this respect. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran pertaining to the role of the husband in a marriage. الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. This is very specific. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the man has status over the woman, and many youngsters in particular interpret this verse to mean that the man is the king in the relationship. Right? That this authority figure in this dynamic that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created deserves respect and honor, and that nobody should say anything to him. But they often forget what comes after. بِمَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بَعْضَهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. Not because he did anything special. Not because he is a man, or because he has lots of wealth, or because he did this and he did that. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him that fadilah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mandates that he gets this respect. Similarly, when me and you as elders and figures that people look up to have the respect of the youngsters, and we have all eyes on us, and we let this get to our head, my dear brothers and sisters, we fall into the trap of wala in kafartum, by being ungrateful and forgetting that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put these eyes on us to begin with. This is something that leads to adhabi la shadid, a painful punishment that none of us want to be subject to. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that any time He gives us any authority, He allows us to rise to the occasion. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for our shortcomings in the examples that we set for future generations. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept our humble efforts, and inshallah grant us Jannatul Firdaus. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulih al-kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Lastly, my dear brothers and sisters, I've spoken at length about what the elders should do. And I don't want anybody to take this to mean that an elder doesn't deserve respect, or that somebody should be disrespected because they're not setting an example. The last point I want to make before we end is that everybody's accountable for what they do. So when we talk about being an elder, we are accountable for the example that we set, and we need to pay attention to that. But if somebody is disrespecting you, if somebody is getting in your way, and somebody is not fulfilling their part of this Islamic contract that we have as brothers and sisters, that is not a good or justifiable thing either. Right? There is obvious levels and hierarchy to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to treat each other. The point of today's khutbah was not to make anybody feel embarrassed, but to give us motivation for understanding that the role we play, even though we feel very small, is very big. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala holds us in very high esteem if only we rise to the occasion. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulih al-kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'd. Fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Qala Allah ta'ala, inna Allaha wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala an-nabi. يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من صلى علي أحدا صلى الله عليه عشرة، أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم إنا نسألك من خير ما سألك منه نبيك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، ونعوذ بك من شر ما استعاذ منه نبيك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وأنت المستعان وعليك البلاغ، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. عباد الله رحمكم الله، إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. اذكروا الله يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم، ولذكر الله تعالى أعلى وأولى وأعز وأجل وأتم وأهم وأكبر، والله يعلم ما تصنعون. وأقيموا الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا